Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ULT San Diego for the Aquarian series. This afternoon, the title of the presentation is Desirelessness. We'd like to say that Mr. Maurice Bichef will be giving us the presentation for today, and our chairperson is Shobha Sharma. But before we begin, a reading. This is from The Voice of the Silence. Kill thy desires, Lanu. Make thy vices impotent, ere the first step is taken on the solemn journey. Strangle thy sins and make them dumb forever before thou dost lift one foot to mount the ladder. Silence thy thoughts and fix thy whole attention on thy master, whom yet thou dost not see, but whom thou feelest. Merge into one sense thy senses, if thou wouldst be secure against the foe. 'Tis by that sense alone, which lies concealed within the hollow of thy brain, that the steep path which leadeth to thy master may be disclosed before thy soul's dim eyes. We now give to you our very own Maurice Bichef.
Thank you, Monica, and welcome to everyone here at ULT San Diego. In the United States, this is the beginning of Labor Day weekend, where we honor labor, and that means almost everyone that's doing some form of work, which is really some form of service. And it's wonderful to become conscious of that and to be conscious and be grateful and have a wonderful attitude when you go out and someone is serving you, particularly when they're giving up their Labor Day weekend to do it. So that's just a precursor to our topic tonight, which is desirelessness. Now, desirelessness, of course, could be a very sublime topic. And so my presentation will be kind of in two parts. One will be pointing to more sublime states of mind or of being, and pointing to paradoxes and indeed mysteries. And then the second part of my talk will kind of relate to desirelessness and its correlates, which of course are different kinds of desires and what that might mean. So that's kind of the way I'm going to proceed this evening. We'll have time for questions. So I'd like to start when we view the idea of desireless, the desireless. It reminds me that theosophy always calls us to aspire to the ideal. Now, we've heard many times a quote that says by Lamartine that the ideal is truth at a distance. But theosophy goes a little bit farther. The theosophy says that we are potentially the ideal, and that through practicing in the real, taking steps in the real, we begin to realize in an inner realization more about the ideal. Yet we also know that veil after veil appears after veil is actually revealed. So there is this tremendous dynamic quality of learning and aspiration. And so if we take the ideal of desireless for a minute, Ramana Maharishi, a great spiritual teacher in India in the 20th century, wrote one sentence which seems to capture some aspects of desireless. When one's true nature is known, then there is being without beginning and end. And it is unbroken awareness, bliss. And it seems like this statement is reflecting what many of us have heard about Sat Chit Ananda, Sat being truth, Chit consciousness, and Ananda being bliss, and emergence of those. So it's really quite a high ideal, but yet, as was said, when our true nature is known, meaning that it's still in us. Another ideal, kind of relative to this subject, is, and for he who desires nothing and despises nothing becomes eligible, even when dwelling in this world, for assimilation with Brahman. And this comes from the Anugita. So he who desires nothing and despises nothing, we can assimilate with the highest. And finally, this connotes, of course, the idea that there's a certain kind of peace that paths all understanding, beyond all understanding, and becomes life itself, living itself, non-separateness. So in various forms, all of these ideals, so to speak, point to this. Shakespeare brings us down to earth a bit when he says, use all gently. For the very torrent, tempest, and, as I may say, whirlwind of passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it a smoothness. So a smoothness, possibly a homogeneity. So in looking at desirelessness, a state of that state, of course, many might focus on the notion of equal-mindedness, equanimity, or even magnanimity, if you will, that are all mental postures rooted in the changeless, beyond the changing. And that there is a discipline and path of developing that steadfastness in heart and mind, which allows one to become more and more detached as a source. And that detachment has a source which is based from something behind it, from whatever preceded it, which is the ever real. So this may seem a bit daunting, but in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says to Arjuna, upholding this entire of the universe with a fragment of myself, I stand apart. And this is very interesting because by standing apart, there is a supreme concern and compassion in the world from whatever precedes it. Yet there is, despite this supreme concern and compassion in the world, there is a supreme detachment. So thus it was said that it made possible for Arjuna, in relationship to his world, both to be involved and stand outside it. So we are having this ideal to attain a kind of golden mental posture, an attitude of mind, through a sacred trust in a guru-chela relationship, through trust and pointing to the spiritual sun, but at the same time working on negating our false conceptions by some intense questioning. But to do that, as we'll find out, we need quietude of mind, and only through quietude of mind can we begin to ask questions about inner meanings and connections and apply principles to and learn and test the ideal in the real, so to speak, or what we think is real, in a multiplicity of contexts. If we then look at maybe two ways of looking at what might point to the ideal or what might point indeed to the mysteries, we can go from the Tao Te Ching, for example, quoting from page 18. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal nature. The nameless is the source of heaven. Earth is the mother of the 10,000 things. Desireless, one may behold the mystery. Desiring, one may see the manifestations. Though one in origin, they emerge with distinct names. Both are mysterious. And this, such a elegant and uplifting way of understanding really captures possibly the essence of being human. The essential or the quintessential aspect of being a human being. That through our vestures and especially our mind, which would be a theme throughout, right? That we are one in origin, yet we may behold the mystery, yet may also see the manifestations, because they're one in origin. And later on, of course, the Tao says, the sage acts without acting, teaches without words. 10,000 things continually wax and wane. Nourishing them, he claims no ownership. Doing his work, he claims no reward. Completing his task, he calls for no commendation. It is work is finished and forgotten. So we could see that if we come from above below, we can begin to see that there's from above the unmanifest, and being in the unmanifest allows us the extent to which we develop purity and inner purity. We can then at the same time operate in the manifest. Now, one more, to me, mind-blowing example of this mysterious relationship. And this comes from the article in the Gupta Vidya by Raghavan Iyer, Volume 2, To Be and Not to Be. But it's about Shiva. Shiva's magically fluid movements in the sublime cosmic dance, Tandava Nitra, enacts the continual victory of immortality over death, of consciousness over form, the ever-existent over the necessarily limited and evanescent. And yet, Shiva has the appearance of being immobile. It is an overwhelming image. Anyone who has seen a statue of Shiva Nataraj, could recognize that it is full of burgeoning potential energy, immeasurable, yet motionless. It is a glorious presentment in a divine human form of the universe as a whole, of rhythmic, harmonious, ceaseless motion. While there are sporadic staccato movements while there are dense shadows and empty spaces, in contrast to the dramatic intensity of movement, at the same time, it is like a blank screen. From one standpoint, one sees form and nothingness, lights and shadows. From another point of view, one senses something deeper, which relativizes light and shadow and makes them both equally unreal in relation to primordial, ever-existing darkness, pregnant with infinite possibility. Such that metaphysically, a profound and purifying theme for deep meditation is the void or darkness of the mysterious tremendum beyond all light and darkness. So the notion of a still point, the notion of a still point not having desire, so to speak, desireless, is not only with us and in us, but there's always something prior to it. Always something prior to it as well. Well, these are tremendous portraits that just point to more of the mysteries. Now we can get into kind of more of the relations of desireless and desire and things like that itself. Because we have to ask, well, desire, as they say, makes the world go round. So when we look at the finest desire, Kamadeva, or universal love, is certainly one of the principles which brings in the world of manifestation, as mentioned in the Rig Veda. From the Theosophical Glossary, Kama itself is a most mysterious and metaphysical subject. Kama is the first conscious, all-embracing desire for universal good, love, and for all that lives and feels, needs help and kindness, the first feeling of tender compassion and mercy that arouse in the consciousness of the creative one force as soon as it came to life and brought as a ray from the absolute. It also, and we're talking about Kamadeva now, connects manas with pure Atma Buddhi. And so this means, of course, that it's not simply something that's inaccessible, but by connecting to manas becomes something that is accessible to human beings, the highest universal love. And of course, it is only later, as we know, that Kama became the power that gratified desire on the animal plane, where, of course, we got attached to that desire got attached to our vestures and a worshiping and expansion of our vestures rather than on the spiritual plane. And this, of course, happened, as we know, in evolution. And so a lot of Kama now is trapped into the lower mind, or Kama manas, which gratifies lower desires and animal instincts, separative aspirations. But nonetheless, when we think of Kamadeva and we connect it with Atma Buddhi, what comes to mind for this student is that we have a source of our witness position, our higher self, which is Atma Buddhi Manas. And so human beings have the power to choose, which is what Manas gives us in the conscious vein, on what planes of our sevenfold consciousness we wish to place our different types of desires. Now, the witness position, the all-pervading eternal, is always operating. Whatever happens, we're there to witness it. However, as we've just pointed out, the obscuration, which are very powerful, solid identifications, habits, addictions, to the lower planes of desire and their attachment to our minds simply don't allow us to reflect as much, to be able to assume, if you will, even for a spark or a moment, sometimes the witness position. So we are then asked through meditation to disentangle ourselves. You could call it disentangle self and non-self, or as some say, unself ourselves. Because when our mind is quiet, we can know ourselves as a pure witness. Shankaracharya said, through peace, the impress of the I is dissolved. So we do need to, of course, prepare ourselves and through discipline for the conditions, if you will, so we can more readily and sometimes consciously actually access our witness position. That and in doing so will allow us, like Thomas Paine said, to allow our soul memory and that of the highest to come forth, usually like Buddhi and lightning bolts when you least expect it. But nonetheless, these tremendous insights, this tremendous intuition, which can be very elevating. And so it's this notion then that desireless may be connected to the witness position. But one has to create the conditions whereby through the lower self, actually, one is able to be more receptive to purifying and having more porosity in the mind, thinking on higher thoughts and not necessarily our separative or animalistic needs in this way. Now, in the Aquarian axioms, HPB writes, will creates intelligently, desire blindly and unconsciously. And then the next axiom, which these could be found in the Theosophical book, the Theosophical Tenets. When desire is purely for the abstract, when it has lost all trace or tinge of self, then it becomes pure. Now, Gandhi may have put this psychologically when he said, when I am free of egotism, nothing remains for me to do, which is maybe another definition, if you will, of desireless. So it does require, as Gandhi said, reducing oneself to a zero, but really we're talking about trying to make ourselves selfless, or again, unselfing ourselves. Now, when desire is purely for the abstract, when it's lost its tinge of self, then we find that we're open to different kinds of desires. And of course, one can say that will creates intelligently, but of course, we also have heard that behind will stands desire. So, but Bhavani Shankar says that there are two kinds of desires, maybe the higher will and lower desire. The higher will is discriminating and the thinking principle, Atma Buddhi Manas. And the personal man is prana as well as other vestures. And between the two, he says, is kama or desire. So the object is to kind of disassociate kama with our lower desires and put our heart on the higher desires. So by putting our heart on our higher desires, we can aspire to discern, to let go of what's more gross, such as to allow the light of Buddhi to reach us. And then to what he says are the higher passions. What might they be? Well, the desire for wisdom about the divine self in each and all. The desire for the company of holy men, those who possess wisdom. The desire to apply this knowledge by doing sacrificial disciplines on behalf of humanity, and not necessarily for oneself. So he's suggesting that these will not come naturally, but by striving to awaken them because they're in us, by purifying ourselves, we will begin to cultivate a desire for wisdom and for the wisdom of love. This more universal love, which connects and binds people together. So this then can become a devotional quality if we both meditate as well as we are devoted to something higher in ourselves that our teachers have given us or have alerted us to. A natural reverence to our teachers, we can capture and be receptive to our witness position, which means to perceive essences directly in its very purest state. And this then becomes something that is less than diverse desires. This higher state becomes something more like will. Will is homogeneous, one-pointed, not necessarily heterogeneous. In our lower desires, in the realms of subjects and objects, in the world of transactions, and there's nothing wrong with that per se. Desire is usually desire for something outside ourselves and desire for objects. With the higher desire, it's not heterogeneous. It's a homogeneous, almost fixation on a certain level of breathing and a certain level of devotion and a certain level of meditation in meditation, so to speak. You're constantly in meditation. So that in this way, you have this higher perspective. One small example of that maybe is when I was in the Himalayas and I asked a teacher who wanted people to come up and ask questions. So I asked, what do you think of all these people that come here from the West? And he was almost like in a meditation. He only said one word. He said, change. And in doing so, what he said was just not making a value judgment about it, simply saying what is, sort of bare necessity, bare reality, if you will. Because he was just more detached, because he was more in kind of a meditation and concentration. So where can we start then? Well, we have to have our heart needs to draw our involvement in the study of great wisdom. It's not just in the head, but we have to coordinate, as we know, the head and the heart. So even our involvement in the study like the Bhagavad Gita or the Key to Theosophy or the Voice of the Silence, they're very important in two ways. One, it is said that, I think Shankaracharya said that wisdom is the great purifier. And it rises up in our hearts. And it can such that it leaves behind the worldly. So that still doesn't mean that one should succumb to ignorance and lower passions and too many diversions. But it does allow for a refinement, just contacting the wisdom religion just contact, just being in a lodge meeting, for example, because it can create unexpected soul wisdom that can unfold in one, while at the same time developing in us this wish to refine ourselves even more, to align our lower self with the higher self through the disciplines of meditation, but then also renunciation. So it is said to know who you are is to find out who you are not. Watch yourself carefully, rejecting with your attention what you are not. Doesn't have to be violent, but through the notion of attention and attentiveness, mindfulness, if you will, that we can begin this process. And this is because the Ishvara is within us, that drop of the divine in us. We do have this divine discontent that we want to aspire and we want to learn. We want to be a disciple, which is to know. So all of this can lead then to a kind of discrimination, a sifting of something more real of less real, more permanent, more than the everlasting. And discrimination will lead to detachment. And in doing so, we can build an inner bridge to our real being. And this requires, however, the paradox is it requires a certain desirelessness, desireless. Because when we come from the witness position, we are in the universal life. We've risen above the bonds of pleasure and pain, or we see pain and experience it in a much different way. Because our motive, as was mentioned, is not about distinct desires, but we've reduced our desires, and we have shifted from desire to acknowledging goodwill and being of goodwill and having goodwill. And this goodwill, then, as distinct from desires, has a joy to it because of the joy of non-separateness and the joy of freedom and the joy of living. A disinterested goodness acting universally on behalf of the universal family in the most particular situations. It's a naturally compassionate response to the world where we're akin to all that lives. And it's kind of like will prayer, only it seems to me this student might call it will compassion, where it's something natural simply to do. It isn't a particular desire separated out for oneself or even for another special person, but it's simply living the life, so living the higher life. So in summary, Hermes, the article in Hermes is the theme for this week. Viraga, or detachment, is indifference to everything but the Supreme Spirit, rooted in a sense of supreme fitness and inner moral necessity. And then we're told by Gandhi that to observe morality is to attain mastery of our mind and passions. So doing, we know ourselves. And we do need to develop, of course, our faith in the power to know. In fact, if we don't have faith or we don't have hope, of course, not related to form, but above form, we only have lower desires, as has been. So the attitude then, the aim is to quietude then is the holding of the mind and heart steadily on the goal. And of course, with a calm reliance on the law. So from the article To Be and Not to Be, to sort of begin to sum up, With these conditions, one can return to the very root of consciousness. It is possible on the plane of thought or ideation to relate oneself in a self-sustaining field, a certain critical distance from form, out of a living awareness, which is always deeper than needed to maintain and sustain activity in existence. Thus, every human being must think of the self as the one that is pre-existent to all the manifestations of one's personal self, one's own states of mind and emotion. For a person to do this continually restores the full awareness of what it means basically to be human. And the Katha Upanishad sort of summarizes: higher than the impulses, higher than the bodily powers and the emotions is the soul. And higher still is the self. Higher than this is the unmanifest. And higher than the unmanifest is the spirit. Katha Upanishad. So we can start by fearlessness, even though we might have terror of the void, of the mysteries, by observing with calmness what is opening within, that inward light, that inward intuition, even that inward conscience. And we can continue to do this by engaging in devotion and meditation on a continual basis to the highest, the Supreme Spirit, the spiritual sun, or even the Guru Parampara chain. One thing this does is to shift our involvement in the unmanifest as opposed to the manifest. Thus, we begin to naturally kill out some desires, although it does take effort. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow captures this with his 3 silences: first of speech, second of desire, third of thought. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maurice. That was beautiful. Desirelessness is also a kind of desire, but it's not the way we look at it. And it keeps reminding me of the light on the path, where MC says, desire only that which is within you, desire only that which is beyond you, and desire only that which is unattainable. And she talks a lot more about desire. And one of my favorite is when she says, desire power ardently. And then she says, and that power that the disciple should covet is that which shall make him appear as nothing in the eyes of men. So this apparent contradiction seems to be the theme of understanding the concept of desirelessness. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a couple of hands up. I'll start with Judy. Go ahead, Judy.
Mute.
Yeah, she's mute. Is there a problem, Judy, to get them mute? Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bishop, for your wonderful discourse on desire. It really is complicated and paradoxical, and indeed that it is very important. Well, it says to desire nothing, but I think what that means, and I remember Nandini and I are discussing this some years ago, to desire nothing for your lower personal self. I mean, for example, you could go to medical school to become a society doctor, and be able to play golf every afternoon, or you can go to really help those who are mentally or physically sick, or you can become a lawyer to defend those who need to be defended justly, or you could become a lawyer to make a lot of money with a corporation. I mean, there are a lot of examples. So it seems it's impossible not to desire, but the desire not for your lower personal needs, but for your higher self. I mean, in a sense, doing service for the world is the best possible desire. I mean, that is desire nothing for the self. Could you comment further on that?
Well, I think that I agree, desire nothing. When we speak about desire, we're usually speaking about the I. And so so if one desires nothing for the personal self, then one isn't really desiring in that sense. There's no separation. There's no instrumental action. That is not the source of the action. There may be action in terms of behavior of some kind. But when we desire nothing, then what's the source of the action? So the source of the action is something beyond us in the pure sense of that word. So when we desire nothing for our personal self, that's true because desire lies in the realm of the lower self.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have Jim. Go ahead, Jim.
Yes, thank you. I'm reminded of the Aquarian axiom. And I was looking at number 6 and number 7, which I find interesting and might throw some further light on our conversation. It says, axiom number 6 from HBB, these are all from HBB. Number 6 says, will creates intelligently, desire blindly and unconsciously. Number 7, when desire is for the purely abstract, when it has lost all trace or tinge of self, then it has become pure. So it seems to me this is something that we could benefit from. That's all. I'm just reading it to you from HBB because it's such an interesting way of putting the problem or question about desirelessness. Because desire can become pure when it's purely abstract. She says that means it's lost all trace or tinge of self and therefore has become pure. That's a monastic activity in the higher sense. Mm-hmm. Anyway, just a thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Laura?
Reese, that was a wonderful talk, very inspiring. And of course, this was Jim mentioned there, the must lose all tinge of self. And it brings to mind HPB's article, at least they think it was her that wrote it, in the Rare Perspectives book, when she talks about love with an object. And in that, she brings up love without an object. And it would seem that to truly love, it has to be devoid of desire. It must be an acceptance of everything the way it is, rather than the way one wishes it to be. Mm. And then one can truly love, it would seem. So, thank you.
Really good, really interesting, because to really accept, one has to have I would think, a quiescence of mind to really have true acceptance, to not vary, to have that kind of a steadfast quietude. Wouldn't you think?
Yes, it takes a lot of practice.
A lot of lives, a lot of practice, yes.
You know, even in our parenting or in our partnerships, you know, that we find that where our mistakes are is the fact in too much desire to have things a certain way. Fear plays a role in that as well. So, you know, it seems that to truly love, there has to be that desirelessness that helps you to overcome the likes and dislikes and the fears that one has within those relationships.
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful.
Yeah. Which reminds me of the fact that true power comes when you let go. True, you know, that story of the wind and the sun fighting over who is more powerful. And the wind keeps saying, I'm the most powerful. And the sun keeps saying, I'm the most powerful. And then the wind says, okay, here's the man going with a coat. I'm going to prove to you that I have the power to make him take his coat off. And so the wind keeps blowing and blowing and blowing. And the man puts on his coat tighter and tighter and tighter. Then the sun smiles and starts shining. And slowly it gets so hot that the man removes his coat. So, you know, it just goes to show that what we really think as power is not power. And humility is another thing that comes here. You talked about fearlessness, even when you have terror within you. I was, Maurice, so I was thinking about the fact about humility is the bravest thing you can do, you know, being humble.
But you so have to involve yourself in the unmanifest. You really have to see it as the real. And you have to see, of course, beyond form and beyond death.
Right.
And immortality. So you really have to operate in the much noumenal world, or in the higher self, if you want to call it that. But what do you think of the witness position as being desireless?
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. We have Arun.
I just want to comment on what Shobha said about power and desirelessness. And this goes to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, you know, in Lines and Times of Ivan Denisovich, where he's in prison. And he realizes that as long as he doesn't want the bread from the guards anymore, they cannot control him. And he's found freedom, and there's tears going down his eyes. And this is a spiritual freedom, you know, only someone like Gandhi might have expressed. And they throw the bread up at him anyway, because he needs to eat. But as long as he doesn't want anything from anyone, he cannot be controlled. I think this is I think this is a important message for life as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Laura, again, do you have a question?
Interesting, you know, there's so many stories in our literature of this position, and even in The Voice of the Silence, where it seems that until we reach that position of desirelessness, nature will not open her doors to us. You know, she will not reveal her secrets to us until we reach that silent witness position. And it seems too like you see that in the book The Lord of the Rings, You know, anyone who has any form of desire will be completely overwhelmed by the forces contained within the ring. You know, so it requires that desirelessness, that witness position, and to affirm steadiness within it. You know, so really it comes to not wanting anything from the Mayavic realm, but it only, as your talk indicated, to have that complete devotion to what is eternal.
Thank you, Laura. I had a little question for you, Maurice. You talked about the fact that you know, will is a form of higher desire. Would you like to kind of expand on that?
Well, I think that when one has purified oneself enough and one is in sort of ceaseless contemplation, even though they're operating in the world, a pretty high state, then one can be very single-pointed and homogeneous. In other words, not have too many desires, but continually focus on that. And so you're really tapping into the higher energy of nous. You're really tapping into much higher energies of where you're actually, as it says, will creates intelligently, as the Aquarian axiom says. So it's that source of energy which is unimpeded by the lower realms of subject and object. Now, that doesn't mean that one can't combine nous and dianoia and think things through and all that, you know, but really just being, I'm not sure if this is a good example, but, you know, we all know kind of what it's like to be in the zone, like athletes are in a zone, or a musician who's so great, they're not thinking about what each note they're going to play, right? Subject and object. No, they're kind of in a whole a realm of going to the original to be original, going to a higher source to be in the higher source, and that's an exercise of continuous will, of continuous heterogeneity. Sometimes athletes might feel that too, like in basketball, all of a sudden someone can make 20 shots over and over and over again, even though they've hardly ever done it before sometimes. So there are these snatches of, even on the lower plane, of but of course that's where purity and motive come in, because obviously it can go the other way as well.
Right.
So that's the best I can say.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that was one thing I wanted to add about motive, and H.P. Blavatsky talks about it all the time.
Yeah.
Motive is so critical in all this. Thank you. Jonathan, do you have something?
Well, maybe. Thank you for asking. So there is the idea, and I think it's in Judge's article, Meditation, Concentration, Will, where, and will has been mentioned several times here, and the contrast with desire. But one of the things in that article, I think, is the idea that by having fewer desires, that enables the strengthening of the will. I was wondering if that could be talked about.
Well, of course, others may be more acquainted with that article than I, but my impression is that if you have many desires, you know, it's what desires one places on the heart. And if you have many desires, it kind of diffuses the focus. Sometimes one might have to, given life circumstances, to do that in different stages of life or different circumstances of life. But the extent to when one can let go, as was pointed out, or renunciate, or to say that I don't need this anymore. I might like it, but I don't need it, because what I'm really focused on is something beyond that fire in one's belly, so to speak, to try to aspire and raise oneself. And Bhavani Shankar pointed out that you have to rouse yourself to do this. It's just not going to come with, okay, now the cycle is pointing upward, so we're all going to go upward. But he says you have to rouse yourself. So it really is a continual, so that's where manas is so important, along with the higher, connected, especially when you're in the higher self, because then you can begin to see, as was probably pointed out last week with karmic relationships, how one can become more harmonic, what your limitations are, what your strengths are. And in doing so, one can begin to kind of strengthen, given your situation, what you can let go of now and what you can't, or what you can loosen or what you can't. But it's a continual dialogue with the self, an inner dialogue with the self that comes out of meditation, or maybe in meditation. But it's so important to have that ideal, that because the ideal is a magnet. And so when we focus on the ideal, that ideal is in us. And to the extent to which we can not fear it, but think about it, maybe dwell on it a bit, read wonderful texts that might stimulate soul memory in unexpected ways, we start to all these desires get all of a sudden focused. And then, waha, it may come together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Laura?
It's interesting, too, with that ideal that you mentioned, and we can consider maybe the Kuan Yin pledge or what's in the declaration, a desire to help others. Then it seems that with that position or that ideal, one then can be able to discern what is not in line with that within one's own nature. And so therein begins the practice and the struggle of Arjuna, would seem, is a recognition, that discernment, and how that position of desirelessness is necessary for true discernment between what is real and what is not real.
Yes, yeah. And of course, taking a vow could really begin to strengthen one-pointedness, and also allows you this moral compass, to use that term, to be able to distinguish the greater good from the lesser good. Because it's kind of easy maybe to determine good and evil at some point, and you can get rid of your stupid habits, so to speak. But the lesser good and the greater good, that's challenging.
Yeah. It takes a lot of practice.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking, when you mentioned the word vow, I was also thinking of sacrifice. And you talked about Bhavani Shankar, and he talks about, I think, 9 forms of sacrifice. And it's very significant that the Gita spends a lot of time talking about this. In fact, it's interesting how all these words kind of coalesce and become important in understanding what true desirelessness implies. Jim has a question.
I just remembered from Thoreau something he meant, but it was also tongue in cheek, as it often is with Thoreau. But he said, after a while, as a young man, I suddenly discovered the secret of wealth, which I'd always distrusted. And what I discovered is, as soon as I reduced my wants to the minimum, my desires to the minimum, and reconceived my needs, I suddenly found I was extremely wealthy because I had far more than I needed. And I was able to make use of it in so many different ways. But it was stripping away that released the will in a deeper sense, which is a recognition, because a recognition or an insight is, in a sense, an aspect of the release of the will, of a spiritual will.
Wow.
It's a mental activity. When you see something that's true and genuine, and you see it, not just hear it, but you see it, you would suppose that that would be an act, an expression of the spiritual will, because it's universal in the particular.
Thank you. Any more questions? Desiree?
Hi, Maurice. Thank you so much. It was a great presentation.
Hi, Desiree. Thank you.
I want to kind of talk about this idea of being in the zone. Also, because so many people who are in the zone they don't have this I concept. It's almost like they're merged with the action itself.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that is almost what it's like when we talk about the Sat Chit Ananda, truth, consciousness, and bliss as synthesized, that we become the actual action itself rather than an object subject. There just seems to be so much in that when folks are really, like for instance, studying. When we study and our object is to know truth, just for truth's sake, not for anything else, not for reward, not for any kind of specific result, but they are involved in this quest for truth. It almost seems like the individual loses the I in that because it's the action, it's the quest that they actually become. You have anything to say about that? And by the way, thank you for being here and giving a presentation on Labor Day weekend.
Great. Thank you all for being here on Labor Day weekend. Yeah, well, the first thing that occurs to me is I think it does come with a whole lot of practice. That if people are really in a zone, I mean, maybe it can happen anytime to anyone on any place, but it seems to me that you have to have some practice. It's like driving. Okay, when you learn to drive, you're not going to be in the zone right away. But then after you've driven the 405 freeway in California for 10 years, almost nothing will really phase you anymore, let's put it that way. And you can even be in the zone and actually be so detached that you can think about other things and still sharply move when needed or honk or do whatever you need to do because you're so trained. So I think that's part of it. But part of it is also, as you indicate, I think, is selflessness. I think, and when you're selfless, there's that joy and freedom because you're just free to do the dance. You're just doing the dance. You're not thinking about how you're dancing particularly because you've already been trained how to dance in many cases. But you can go beyond the how to dance to just dance with the situation. And So that's kind of how I think of Shiva's dance, intuitive dances. When now there are important consequences to that movement, so I'm not trying to make it something simple by any means, but there's a rhythm, a cosmic rhythm to it, and getting in touch, being in the zone is kind of being in that rhythm beyond thinking about subjects and objects, but like when you're shooting basketballs, you're just in the rhythm. But maybe others have something to say about being in the zone.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Judy, did you have a question?
Well, I just had a comment. I think the verse that speaks very well to this whole idea of desire is in the Upanishads, where it says, "From the unreal lead me to the real, from darkness lead me to light, from death lead me to immortality." And I want to thank everyone very much for their comments and Maurice's wonderful talk.
Yeah, I'd say we got maybe 3 more minutes. And does anybody, Shobha, do you have any final thoughts, or Maurice? Or actually, there's 2 more. There's a hand up there.
Yes.
Laura does.
Laura. We'll give it to Laura.
Yeah.
So inspiring. The talk, my head is just full of ideas and thoughts. And thinking in terms of the nature of the zone, as you asked that question and what we thought about that. If we strive to reach the zone, we won't get there.
Hmm.
It will evade
Really
us.
good point. Yeah, really good point.
Very good
Yeah.
point.
There's your Zen statement for the day.
Thank you, Laura.
Well, could I tell you about next week a little bit?
Well, maybe just, I think, just
Go
one
ahead.
final comment, Jonathan.
Yeah, please.
At least in terms of my brief reading, and the word mystery always comes up, whether it's in the Tao or whether it's in the mystery schools, or there's always a mystery, and that's why a desireless one can observe or become aware of mystery. So I just wanted to, and a lot of times we're going to get on how to get in the zone and make baskets and stuff. And Laura's comment was very good. And that's what reminded me of the fact that in the end, we have to love and enjoy the mystery of truth. It's truth seeking. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Maurice. Beautiful, inspiring, thought-provoking talk. Thank you, Shobha, so much for deftly guiding us through this.
Thank you.
Beautiful meeting.